first college football playoff rankings are out, and people are big mad. So naturally, we're going to pile on. Let's get to it. This is Football Frenzy. Welcome to the Frenzy, everybody. It is November. This is the Iceman Matt Freights. That is the coach, Brad Powell. We have a lot to get to. The first college football rankings are out, and people have a lot of opinions. We got a lot to get to. Coach, welcome, buddy. How you doing?
Iceman, doing well, man. It's been busy, right? Bradley basketball started. We're in the middle of college football. You and I have talked offline. We haven't brought it online. But I am returning to the wrestling coaching ranks this winter to help out the local junior high where I coached for a long time. They were in need, and so coming back to kind of get things on track and hopefully mentor some young guys. So that's starting to fire up here a little bit. So I've been doing some things to get organized for that. Yeah, man, and just life, right? Things are getting busy, prepping for Thanksgiving's going to be here in a few weeks, and then Christmas, and here we go. So. It's a great time of year. I think you and I always enjoy this time, this time of year, and it's always been something we've talked a lot about on the shows. So looking forward to that. And otherwise, man, no complaints, really. I mean, doing okay.
So I think I should say that there are certain people, if you're rolling through here through the course of the next hour and a half, I know that there are people who are feeling a certain way after some things that happen. You and I don't really get political. So what we are striving to do is add a little bit of positivity to some people's lives and kind of, I don't know, man, chop it up like two friends talking sports, because the world will continue to revolve. And you're right. Life is busy right now. Obviously, I've talked about that on the show, that I have aging parents and things are happening. And I'm going to be traveling here in a little bit, but we're going to get this show in. We have fired up Braves talk for anybody who's coming here from Bradley University. You will get as much Braves talk as you want from now until the end of the season. And so we are going to bring a ton of content to you. But I'm going to ask you a question. Do you remember back in June when you told me that you couldn't wait for football to get here? It seemed like it had been forever. And now here we are on the precipice of Thanksgiving, and we're getting closer to the end of football. And it's just weird how fast time flies.
That's how everything is, right? You look forward to the stuff you really enjoy, and then it seems like it drags and drags, and then here it comes, and then it flies by. I wish that my Mondays went by as fast as my Saturdays. We kind of joke about that. We joke about that at work sometimes on Fridays, and everybody gets ready to leave. Some of the guys, they'll be like, all right, man, see you in about 20 minutes. Cause that's what it feels like. When you walk out of work on a Friday, before you're back. So yeah, we're here, man. And we are in the heat of it now with the college football rankings for the first time coming out, last night. And, of course, as you would imagine, plenty of controversy. Sir, I don't know about controversy, but everybody's got an opinion, and you're about to hear ours.
I laughed, though, last night because they're revealing this, and I'm probably one of the only people in the United States of America who's watching this show at the time, because last night was election night, obviously, so people were kind of glued to the TV. I know. Dude, and so I think when I texted you, you probably turned it on, because I had texted you at some point. I don't want to give it away. We're going to show a very fancy graphic here that I 100% stole from the internet, but I think it is a graphic that probably was even used last night. But before we get into the actual X's and O's of the actual rankings, I do want to talk a little bit about philosophically. I was having a chuckle to myself last night, because there's tons of controversy, right? You go on social media, if you're a fan of a certain school or a certain conference, you feel a certain way about these rankings, when, in my opinion, and I think Budge has said this, and I think I even retweeted it last night, there should really only be the final, because there's so much arguing from now until then, and it gets ratings, it pops in terms of social media clicks and stuff, but when it comes to the actual football, it doesn't matter at all.
You're right about that, but think about how entertaining it is that we're going to get this every week, between now
I don't disagree
and
with you on that.
I mean, I think that's the biggest thing. You're right. It really, essentially, it means nothing, because several of these teams play each other, which we'll talk about, and this is going to look a lot different probably when it gets finalized, but it gives people like you and me and, everybody else at work with their office mate or whatever, something to talk about, something to debate about, something to have an opinion about. And we get to rehash it all, every week from here on out until it's all finished. So I think it's just the entertainment value of it. But yeah, from a real nuts and bolts perspective, it doesn't really mean anything.
Was there anything holistically that sort of caught your eye before we get into the teams?
Well, let me take. I said it doesn't mean anything, but to circle back to when we talked about rankings at the beginning of the season, about how like you hate preseason rankings and stuff like
yes.
The purpose or whatever of this, where it is meaningful, is sort of where you start, right? It's like
Yes.
based off where you start in this thing, it really dictates kind of where you can go as you win and lose. And maybe some teams realized they had a little bit more breathing room than they did before, and other teams realized, wow, the margin might be a little thinner than I thought based off where we got ranked. But I was surprised when I first looked at it at a team that's not even in the top 12, and that is SMU, right at 13, first team out, man.
Yes, and there you go.
Caught my eye for sure.
Yes, for those of you watching on YouTube, obviously we have this graphic here, but for those who are listening in audio, we are going to try to go through this as well as we can. So Brad is alluding to a team outside. So what they've done here in terms of this first ever college football ranking with this 12-team playoff is they've kind of given us an NCAA tournament look, because you know how whenever you see Bubble Watch, you kind of get first four, last four, which I always appreciate because it gives me some context as to sort of how these teams are jockeying for position. So I do agree with you. And I think when I said there's no value, it's more in the like, people are taking this ranking as it being the be-all, end-all. And it's not that, right? It's the starting point for what is now going to be the second act of college football, because this first act kind of got us here. And from here on out, these teams kind of know where they are. And I think to an extent, too, people like us, it gives us a little bit of insight into maybe some criteria of what the committee is thinking, which I think is a transparency we haven't really gotten when you only get four teams. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would agree with that, because a lot of times, like, you can just strictly go off record, right? I mean, a lot of years there are, three undefeated teams, and maybe you get one loss that, the team that loses the SEC championship game is usually the fourth team gets plugged in or whatever. It's, a lot of times it was pretty clear who was going to be those top four. There wasn't a lot of drama surrounding it. And a lot of it was just purely record based if you were in a power conference, where I think one thing that was very apparent here, at least in my opinion, is that the eye test. The committee appears to really value the eye test. And what kind of told me that was Alabama.
Yes. And that was definitely a surprise for me, seeing Alabama. I think even in it, is that what you're alluding to?
Yes.
Yes. So we'll start at 14, second team out. That's Texas A&M. Now, we talked about them last week, and I believe they lost this past week, did they not?
They did. Yep.
After
lost
you
to
said
South Carolina.
Yeah. You said they were a completely different team. Kiss of death for the show. So goodbye, Texas A&M. But one thing I do want to point out that I didn't get to say last week is that this Texas A&M team is not a Jimbo Fisher team. So Jimbo Fisher team would not be able to change their identity, and I think that's why he's not there. So I think Mike Elko obviously has them rolling strong, but I think the team you're alluding to in the biggest surprise for you was SMU being out of the top 12 at 13.
Yeah, definitely. Kind of surprised to see them there. And then the fact that, and I'm going to look here real fast and try to make sure I'm not missing them entirely.
Who are you looking for?
I mean, at least in the top 14, Clemson, man, that loss,
Yes.
They just plummeted, right?
Yes, they did.
And so SMU obviously slid ahead of them in the committee's eyes, which I thought was interesting. And another thing about Texas A&M, I think we mentioned last week, is there was a game out there, right? After the LSU game, now there's tape on the offense, running that style of offense. And we saw how big of a difference that made going into South Carolina. But there's still, I think, a dark, they're not out of the running yet. There's some crazy things could happen in the SEC, and they could easily sneak themselves back into this thing. But, the SMU being up there is definitely interesting, especially if they find their way into an ACC title game with Miami.
Yeah, and they're going to have to do that, because I think SMU being out at this point with how impressive they've looked lately, I mean, they're winning the games that they're winning, is an indictment on the ACC. And we did kind of talk about that there is not an ACC team that has been challenged nationally, and Clemson wasn't even challenged nationally and still lost recently. And now you have SMU, who probably also falls into that category, and we just don't know. So moving into the top 12, we have Boise State at number 12, who we said was kind of holding the flag for the group of five. You have Alabama at number 11. I found that surprising. Notre Dame coming in at number 10. Obviously, that Northern Illinois loss is hurting them in this ranking, because that's, not number 10. Like, they're 2 spots from actually being out of this particular ranking. BYU at number 9. That was also surprising to me, but we'll get into that. Indiana 8, Tennessee 7, Penn State 6, Texas 5, Miami 4, Georgia 3, Ohio State 2, and Oregon 1. And so that sets up these brackets now where you have 5-12 and everything. So you kind of see how these things form out here. And when I look at BYU, obviously they're the 4th seed, but they're ranked number 9. It's very obvious to me that the committee does not value their resume. And the other thing that stood out to me was Texas. Their win at Alabama has not aged well. And now having lost to Georgia, their resume all of a sudden doesn't look as strong.
Well, one thing I think is it doesn't appear that they're valuing strength of schedule that much in some cases, like BYU, for example. But granted, BYU, they're in position for the buyer. Whoever wins the Big 12 is not going to have an outstanding strength of schedule, and they're going to be in position to, get that number 4 slot most likely. Yep. And another thing about Boise State, I mean, they're legitimately ranked 12th. It's not like they're ranked 19th or 20th.
Correct.
And at the 12th position because of the group of 5 situation. I mean, they could theoretically sneak up in this a little bit, seed-wise possibly, which would be really interesting, especially, seeing what happens between Indiana and Ohio State when they play and like what's remaining in the SEC. I mean, this is going to get messy, man. And
yes.
Which is great. It's entertaining, but there's so much that could happen between now and the end of the season.
Yeah, and we do have a question here. What is the committee seeing in Penn State? Now, I think that's referring to the fact that Penn State just lost to Ohio State this past weekend. And that was a game we had talked about, right, where it was kind of can James Franklin win the big one? Is Ryan Day going to get fired essentially for losing this game? And obviously Ohio State comes out on top. The talent disparity is there. I mean, I think Penn State is getting the nod because it seems like the top of the Big Ten is very strong. And so I think that the committee is valuing how tough the Big Ten is, but it will be interesting as the season goes along. As you pointed out, Ohio State's going to have to play Indiana. And Ohio State at number 2, if they lose a second game, do they remain in the top 12?
I don't think so. I do not think that they will. If they drop the game to Indiana, I don't think, because I don't know that they'll have a path to the Big Ten title game at that point in time.
Yeah, it's very possible. But they'll have 2 quality losses, probably the 2 biggest quality losses, assuming that Indiana would continue that trend upward, right?
You're right. But one thing that I've heard people talk about it, I think we have to acknowledge the elephant in the room, as unfair as it may be, is Indiana is being judged a lot by the IU on the side of the helmet. That team, I think, is better than the number 8 ranked team or 9th seeded, whatever team in the country, realistically. And if they had, maize and blue helmets, I think that they would be 3 or 4 possibly.
Yeah.
And so I think that, unfortunately, a loss to them by Ohio State may not be seen as a great loss, because that Ohio State team they're ranked number 2 currently in the ranking, even though they're at the 5 seed because of the buys. The committee thinks pretty highly of Ohio State.
Sure.
And so,
their only loss is to the number 1 team in the country. Like, we should acknowledge that.
In a good game, yeah.
Yeah, in a very, very good game. But, you could even make the argument Penn State and Indiana should swap based off of how things have gone out to this point.
Yes.
But when I look at this bracket, and this is something I've seen, and I think I agree with it, is that the 5 seed in this particular setup is almost overpowered in the fact that, like, the 4 seed is going to be the weakest of the conference champions. So now Ohio State is looking to, like, it almost seems like not a guaranteed path to the semifinal, but certainly an easier path to the semifinal, where you got to play Boise, and then you get to play the weakest of the conference champions to get there. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's like Ohio State being the number 2 team in the country, getting the 5 seed is almost better in some respects than getting a bye.
Yeah, and that's one thing that Notre Dame, the Notre Dame people were talking about going into the season with a 12-team playoff is, Notre Dame, if they take care of their own business most years, they're in the driver's seat for the 5 seed because an undefeated Notre Dame right now would be in the top 5.
100%.
And they can't have a bye because they're not in a conference, and they would be lined up for that 5 seed where you get the number 12 and then into the 4, who's going to be the weakest conference champ. You have the easiest path to the semifinals. And you still have to play good football, but you could get through those first 2 rounds fairly comfortably if you are a high-powered program and set yourself up. And maybe more healthy. There's a lot of things. It's going to be really interesting because none of us know what this looks like when it actually plays out on the field and the toll it takes on these teams. Because these teams, the NFL, there's so much parity in the NFL. Those guys are playing, razor thin, tight games week after week against the best in the world, where at this level, even in the SEC, rarely are they playing 4 tough games back to back to back to back like this. And so it's going to be really interesting to see who can hold up, not just physically, but mentally throughout this playoff.
Yeah, and if you look at the names, let's take just the names on the side of the helmet here. I mean, you have a lot of marquee names that's going to sell a lot of tickets. It's going to get a lot of people to watch. And that is something we talked about before, and even before thinking about what these rankings would look like realistically. And you've got an Alabama in there, and that's a team that we want to focus on because at one point in the season, they looked sneaky like they could be one of the better teams in the country. The Vanderbilt loss, and then, of course, you have the Georgia loss. I mean, no, not the Georgia loss. Then, of course, you have the Tennessee loss. And obviously, Tennessee in this bracket, but only 3 slots ahead. And so my question is Alabama there purely based on brand?
I just think that the committee has watched Alabama and watched their offense. And when their offense is on, I don't know if anybody can stop them. Their offense is really, really good. Jalen Milroe is extremely talented player. And, Kalen DeBoer, offensive guy. But I think obviously to hold up through this playoff, you're going to have to play defense. And that's something they have not shown the ability to do. And that has to make Nick Saban just completely want to crawl out of his skin when he sees this.
And I think the other element for some of these teams is the toughness factor. And I know toughness is sort of it is a subjective measure, but you're talking about having to go through the gauntlet of the season, come out relatively unscathed in order to get in here, especially the teams that have a bye. Now, of course, they have an advantage because they're going to get that extra week off. And if you look at the teams that are there, Oregon doesn't really need a week off. Georgia doesn't need a week off. They have just so much depth on their roster. But all these other teams are going to have to now go through a gauntlet. I mean, look at Indiana. We just talked about the fact that we think that they are better than what their ranking is here. They're going to have to beat a Tennessee team that has beaten a lot of good teams. And then what's their prize for that? Oh, they get to play Oregon. And Oregon is the clear best team in the country right now, which means they're going to lose this week. But you see my point, right? It's this is going to be difficult. Even if Alabama beats Texas, they then have to play Miami. And Miami has been ripe for the pickings, but continues to win. And we're going to get to that later with your pick of the week. None of this is going to be easy. I mean, this is going to be very, very difficult. And then even looking at Notre Dame. When Notre Dame is on this year, they've looked pretty good. But again, their prize for beating Penn State, if that happens, they get to play Georgia. We don't know. And even if we feel good about these rankings, even if we feel really confident that the committee got it 100% right, chaos is still going to ensue because we have never seen a bracket quite like this. And the toughest teams, mentally and physically, are going to be the ones to move on. And that's where this is all going to be subjective in the end.
Oh, absolutely. And but I think that's what's so great about the 12-team playoff. I would love, Budge does a playoff eliminator on TikTok. He does it every week where he eliminates teams that he considers to be eliminated from the playoff contention. And I want to ask him sometime, if he can go back and look at last year and throughout the season and how many more teams are still in the hunt for the playoff here going into week 8 compared to week 8 last year in the 14 picture, and I would imagine it's more. And so I think that more teams that are still in the hunt halfway through the season, headed on the home stretch here, we're 2/3 away through the season, makes it way more interesting. And it keeps more fan bases engaged, more high stakes games to watch as fans. And I could not be more excited. And I'm very curious to see, who's the first December legend that gets born out of this college football playoff, whether it's a coach or a player or whatever that seems to, thrive in this sort of setting or environment. I think that'll be fun to see kind of as this playoff evolves over the next several years.
Yes. And I think the other thing, 2 things. I want to look at teams that are in this right now. And I want to ask you specifically, if you have a team or even 2 maybe that you think is most likely to drop out of this ranking before all is said and done.
Most likely to drop. I mean, Alabama is probably the most primed to, because they play LSU this Saturday night, Death Valley. I mean, that's a tough
Tough ask.
That's a tough out for anybody. Yeah, tough ask. And so I think them, and then I'm not buying BYU quite yet. They've got the Holy War this week against Utah. That there's a lot of bad blood there, even if Utah's not what they've been. They're going to have to survive the Big 12 title game, which is, who knows what that's going to be right now. But it's the Big 12 is a bunch of teams that are just good, right?
Yes.
It's the conference of very good. There's no one there that I think is elite, and maybe I'm not giving BYU enough credit. Hell, most of them are probably like 28 years old, so maybe they got that on their side. But I just think the Big 12 is going to get messy, and even Miami, their luck's going to run out at some point, right? I mean, maybe not. So
Yes, but somebody from the ACC has to make it. So,
sure.
you know what I'm saying?
Well, yeah, they likely don't fall out. That's what's interesting. It's like, are there going to be bid stealers? So let's say that, I don't know who still has a path to the ACC title game. Let's say that maybe Clemson still does, or obviously SMU does. Or
Yep.
I mean, let's say there's someone. I mean, I think Virginia Tech's now probably eliminated from the title game. But if somebody backs their way into this ACC title game and knocks off Miami, and that would be one loss for them, what's that do to a 2-loss if we have a 2-loss Tennessee, or the 2-loss Alabama, or Penn State? I mean, it's going to get really interesting, and that's something we haven't seen because this hasn't existed, that we always see in the NCAA basketball tournament are these bid stealers. That's Indiana State didn't make the NCAA tournament last year because there were so many bid stealers, and where you had one bid leagues where the best team still made it, plus the team that won the conference title, and so on and so forth. But there's just so many crazy things that can happen. Is there anyone that you think is kind of just hanging on?
I think Boise, obviously, as a group of 5 team, is hanging on. Now, I think that they have a good chance because they're obviously a very talented football team, and they probably are going to continue to roll. But at the same time, I think that the way that this is set up, it is a little bit flimsy. I think you're right. I think Alabama is going to get hit hard with the rest of the schedule, especially with this game against LSU. I think that other teams are somewhat safe. I mean, BYU, the Big 12 champion, is obviously going to make it. And I do want to acknowledge this comment here. Thank you from Sam about who emerges as a dark horse after the first 4 games will be amazing. 4 amazing home games to boot. That's something that we've talked about. The fact that this is just going to be cinema, essentially, on a football field, because that's what we're looking for. But if you look at the rest of this, let's just talk about the rest of the teams after Texas A&M. So you talked about LSU. They're sitting there at 15. Ole Miss at 16. Iowa State, who just lost. That was a game that we called last week that we said was going to be really, really tough for them, losing to Texas Tech. And then you got Pitt, who just had their first loss. They're at 18. Kansas State, and number 20, Colorado. So there's a lot of intrigue even just outside of these, these 14 teams. And I think there are some bid stealers in there, at least teams that can cause some chaos, but a lot of them do reside in the Big 12, which you called the conference of very good.
Well, just think about this right now. Close your eyes and imagine you open them, and instead of BYU in that number 4 spot, it's Colorado.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And just changing that alone, the entertainment value of this playoff just went through the roof.
Oh, 100%.
And, because if there's anybody, you feel like if there's anybody who's going to show up in prime time, no pun intended, it's going to be Coach Prime and his guys. They're going to be ready to roll. And just imagine if you get Ohio State and Colorado, man, in the quarterfinals.
Oh my God. That would be amazing.
I think anybody, I feel like that's a lopsided matchup, talent for talent, top to bottom, roster wise. But, I don't know.
You never know.
We gotta talk about this one too. I see Indy in there, so we'll have to talk about it. So if the Fighting Kiffins can beat Georgia, does Notre Dame get booted out of the top 12, especially if Bama loses to LSU? It could be interesting. Notre Dame's going to, obviously they have to take care of business, so it'd be an 11-1 Notre Dame you're talking about. If they lose again, they're out for sure. But they need Miami to hold on and win the ACC. They can't have anybody sneak in there. I think the Big 12 is a one-bid league no matter what. And then, if Bama loses to LSU, Bama's out.
Yes, 100%. So it'll be 3 loss.
Yeah, if Bama beats LSU, I think that makes it more complicated at that point in time. So, it's certainly possible. The one thing Notre Dame has going for them, admittedly, is the brand value. It's really in a situation where they're 11-1, and you could make the argument they deserve to be in. They have a good enough resume to be in. The committee is going to have a hard time keeping them out.
I think 1 loss is not going to keep them out. But if there's something that committee told us, I know we kind of joked about it a couple weeks ago, but you said last week that their signature win would be against Army. Army's 25 in this first ranking. So obviously, even undefeated, even though they have a very good chance at winning their conference, The committee doesn't think a lot of them, which I think is fair because they're a service academy. They play much lower level competition. And so if that's Notre Dame's signature win by the end of the day, that is going to be tough. But I do agree with you. The brand value matters a lot, and especially with those fringe teams.
Well, and the signature wins, at this point, it's going to be Texas A&M. Hopefully they finish the season strong. Louisville, that win has kind of bounced back and forth as far as like its value.
Yes.
Them beating Clemson this past week obviously helps bolster that, but then A&M losing the South Carolina hurt. So, I mean, and then Navy, what's screwed up, they've talked about this, some of the Notre Dame stuff I listened to, they've talked about this. Every team that outside of maybe A&M, because A&M came out a little sluggish, but they took care of business after Notre Dame beat them. Every other team that Notre Dame's beaten, they've gone out the next week and just looked terrible. Seriously though, it's like playing Notre Dame took so much out of them that they just can't muster up the strength.
Are you saying that Notre Dame is the Detroit Lions of college football? Because every time teams play the Lions in the NFL, they lose the next week.
I would have to go back and look like game for game and see if that's been the case, but I feel like it's certainly happened more often than not, and a lot of times against inferior opponents, which it stinks because it's like you're like, okay, like Notre Dame beats Louisville, okay, Louisville, let's hope Louisville takes care of business. And I can't remember who Louisville went out the next week and dropped a game to, but it wasn't a power by any means. My dad probably knows, he'll chime in, but
yeah, they've lost 3 games, so they've dropped it to a few.
Yeah, so it'll be interesting, though, to see how this all plays out. I'm really excited. There's a lot of fun things that could happen. Yeah, if Ole Miss beats Georgia, things get super interesting. And, I'm just along for the ride at this point.
So let me ask you, because we've talked about this with the NCAA tournament, how we root for chaos. Are you rooting for chaos here?
Yeah, I don't think chaos helps Notre Dame, unfortunately, depending on how it happens. But I love the chaos, though. It's so entertaining. I don't think Notre Dame's a national championship contender, honestly, if I'm being just completely objective. So, there's not as much as I want to see them in this playoff and see what they can do, and how much I know their fan base, the fan base as a whole is going to lose their mind if they don't make it. I'm rooting for chaos more so than anything. And Indy's on a cliff. Committee would be more than happy to drop Indy if SEC crapshoot plays right. You might be right.
But that's a good debate,
very well
right?
Might be right.
That's a good debate. Is a debate of what's the bigger brand, the SEC or is Notre Dame still as a singular brand, right? Because the SEC obviously is a collection of different brands. I think you could say Alabama, Georgia, even Tennessee to an extent, they're all brands. Notre Dame also is a brand, but it's a brand outside of the other larger brand, right? It's almost like these schools are like a subsidy of the SEC, if you think about it that way, right? The SEC is a brand, but if you look at these rankings here, what is there? 1, 2, 3, 4 teams are in the SEC. So it's like you already have a third of the field. Is having a fifth fringe SEC team something that they think will drive people? Does it depend on the fan base? Notre Dame fans, do they travel well? These are things I think that they're going to have to consider if you're talking about brand. And I think that will matter. And we'll kind of get a glimpse of that as things go along. How far does Notre Dame move up, right? These schools that are at the bottom, they keep winning. Because one of the things that I heard yesterday, I think it was Joey Galloway, who said, look, for all the complaining that we're doing about where the committee put these teams, all they have to do is keep winning, which I realize is like the hardest thing to do, just keep on winning. But it's true. You keep winning, you take care of your own business, and hopefully you will be rewarded for continuing to take care of business. But that's what the hardest part is you play all these teams that now you have a target on your back. And so when you play like BYU, you play the Utahs of the world. Yeah, they're not what they usually are, but they're coming for you. And I think that's what's going to be interesting and where the chaos is really going to ensue.
Yeah, I think you're right. And, a lot of these teams are in survive and advance mode right now. And what's interesting, though, is how much are the style points going to matter? Like for a team like Notre Dame, I think they're going to matter. For a team like Alabama, even, with 2 losses, I think they're going to have to go out and really try to put on a show and impress. And, we talked about the eye test and stuff like that. So it will be really fun and exciting to see how things shake out.
Yes, but if we look at the matchups we got coming up this week, we're going to move to a little NFL talk, but let's talk about it. So obviously my Virginia Tech Hokies are hosting Clemson this week. They have a chance to play spoiler. They blew the game in Syracuse, if I'm being perfectly honest. They had a chance to win. They just could not pull it off. And I was talking with some friends of mine, and we all kind of agree that we don't think that Pry is the guy. And that's not meant to be cute. It's just I don't think that that's true. not coming up in the big moments. However, they do have a chance to play spoiler. And if Clemson wants any chance at making this playoff, aka the path to the ACC title game, they're going to have to win this game. I think they're 6.5-point favorites on the road. I mean, I hope that Virginia Tech's ready for this game, but I think Clemson, especially after a loss, I don't think they're going to get caught twice.
You wouldn't think so. It'll be interesting to see what Dabo is able to do, because I think if he drops this game, I don't think he's on the hot seat, but I think everyone's, we've talked on the show last year, is can he do it without the Trevor Lawrence and Deshaun Watsons of the world? And, and Cade Klubnik obviously is not that guy. And so how is he without that star quarterback? And obviously he's still a very good football coach, but we know how people are. We know how fan bases are. We heard the radio show thing last year where that fan got after him and everything else.
Great. So
I think that, things are going to get real weird for him at Clemson if they drop this game and they miss the playoff for sure. Yes. But like you said, man, Virginia Tech's got a chance to play spoiler. And I think it's going to be fun to see if some teams really embrace that role here down the stretch.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that if there's a team to do it, this is what I want from this team. I want them to come out and embrace that role, but we'll see. So we talked Notre Dame. They're playing Florida State. If they don't win this game, they clearly do not deserve to be in the playoff, because I don't know if I have seen a worst to first situation the way that Florida State has just absolutely crapped the bed. And I don't think that it's a firing situation, but going from complaining about being in the playoff to 1-8, have you seen anything like that?
No, man. No, not in college football. You don't see it. But again, this is
with
not
the same head coach, by the way. We're not turning over.
Daddy's right. This ain't your daddy's college football, though. The transfer portal, these rosters are turning over pretty significantly year to year in some cases. So I think we may see more of it, unfortunately, in the future. I think it's going to become more common. But as far as the game against Notre Dame, I think it's great that Florida State's coming to South Bend in November. I pray for 35 degrees, windy and rainy. I think that would be just swell for the visitors from South.
I agree.
But Notre Dame's really just got to take care of Notre Dame at this point, because you can't afford a loss to any of the remaining 4 teams on the schedule. So go out, because they finish with Florida State, Virginia, USC, and then Army. And yep. I think I'm not 100% positive this moment, but I am. I'm probably 80% sure that I will be at the Notre Dame Virginia game next weekend.
Oh, good. Go Notre Dame. Because, I don't like UVA. Before we get to these last 2 games, we have one last question here from Sam. What does the committee take, or who does the committee take? 1 loss BYU, 1 loss Notre Dame, or 1 loss Miami if SMU wins out? And he is talking about the fact that Notre Dame is not safe. But I think, again, these are decisions that the committee is going to have to make, and I think that it's going to come down to so many different factors, and that's why the football needs to be played. We can't make that decision here, but
yeah, I mean 1 loss Notre Dame's and over 1 loss BYU, fair or not fair, 100 times out of 100, I think. But the scenario you mentioned though of SMU,
unless of course BYU wins the Big 12,
yeah, right. But if BYU gets knocked off, 1 loss BYU, unfortunately for them, I think Notre Dame's in. Most likely. And then the scenario with SMU, that's probably the one that's more threatening to Notre Dame, because it would be tough. Even though Miami's played a lot of really close games,
they've won.
It would be tough to leave out a 1-loss Miami if SMU is able to get it done in the ACC championship game.
Not to mention if Cam Ward wins the Heisman.
But someone else could fall victim to that as well. I mean, let's just think about a 1-loss Indiana. A 1-loss Indiana, unfortunately, as unfair as it would be, a 1-loss Indiana probably plummets out of these rankings.
You're probably right, and it probably has something to do with the decal on the side of the helmet than anything else. But we'll see, right? If their only loss is to Ohio State, is that a quality loss? We'll see. The committee is going to show themselves more and more. So this is the first ranking, so this is what we have to go on.
Good talk.
I absolutely agree. I want to thank Sam for his contributions there, because it did allow us to expound a little bit on some of the stuff we were talking about. But getting through the SEC, Georgia at Ole Miss. I mean, this is an eliminator game, I would say, for Ole Miss. If Ole Miss is to pull off the upset, even though Lane Kiffin does have a little bit of trouble winning these types of football games at Ole Miss, which I think is something that you've said may be the reason why a Florida job, if it comes open for Billy Napier's firing, might be something that intrigues him, because a little more resources, maybe a little more pull. But this is Georgia now. Georgia knows that, okay, they lost to Alabama. They're not going to get caught again. Kirby Smart's going to beat up any player, opposing player, whether it's his own player. I still can't believe he's coaching, but it wasn't suspended at all. But this one should be intriguing, and we're going to get a real glimpse as to where Georgia lies. And this is going to be a tough road test. So I would not be surprised if it's close, but I kind of see Georgia pulling this game out.
Is Lane Kiffin like the next generation Brian Kelly? Like just wins a lot, but just doesn't win the real big ones.
So that could be true. And that Brian Kelly, though, I think if I can be fair to Brian Kelly, I'm not a huge Brian Kelly guy, but as a head coach, I obviously understand that he's a good head coach. He's won a ton of football games, and he's done so with long tenures at schools. And I think that's something that does set him apart from Lane Kiffin. Lane Kiffin has, and this is not throwing shade at Lane Kiffin, but obviously he's gone and had cups of coffee at many different places in what has seemed like an attempt to move up as fast as possible. And obviously he hit the bottom when I think it was Saban who left him off the bus after they lost the national championship game or something like that. And, he's kind of climbed back up. But I think it might be fair to put some type of a label on him of can't win the big one in the SEC. But then again, not many people can. I mean, Brian Kelly is losing games like this in the SEC as well. So maybe this is just a product of the SEC, and it's something that Lane Kiffin, we haven't really seen him be at, because Brian Kelly was at Cincinnati, right? Took Cincinnati to very high heights. And even at Notre Dame with the academic restrictions, took them to the highest of heights, but couldn't win the biggest game. And that was kind of the narrative of his term there. At LSU, it's the same thing. So maybe. But I think it might be more. We've never seen Lane Kiffin outside of the SEC. So the SEC's hard. It matters more.
I do think that sort of the 12-team playoff is going to change how coaches are viewed, because just think about the NFL. Like if NFL coaches had the winning percentages of some of these college coaches, they would never lose their jobs, right? But these college coaches have always been they're purely judged off making the playoff, competing for national championships.
Sure.
That's really all anybody cares. I mean, I get that's the name of the game, but there was such a small window for entry that it made it nearly impossible. I mean, only 4 teams got a crack at it, and there's way more Division I college football teams than there are NFL teams. These guys are losing 1 to 2 games a year and still not getting a shot at it, have these great winning percentages, but get fired because, they're not making it to the playoff. Or now you're going to have these guys who are, getting to the playoff. And for a lot of schools, maybe not SEC schools, but for a lot of schools, that's going to be good enough. You're going to start to see like the Mike Tomlin types that are at a school that they go, hey, you know what? Like every year they're going to make the playoff, and maybe like once every 10 years they make a run to the national championship game. But they're always going to be in the hunt to make the playoff and have a crack at it. And it'll be interesting to see how that narrative changes with the playoff.
And I know you're looking for the next Eli Manning or Tom Coughlin of college football, where they make these Daniel Day-Lewis runs. They only get to the playoff every 5 years, but damn it, they win an Oscar every single time they make it.
Funny.
And that will add a different layer to college football. We are used to calling them Heisman moments, right? This is his Heisman moment. Well, now the Heisman will be passed, right? And we'll be looking at, this is the playoffs now. Then you're right. There will be a distinction to be made about guys in college, right? Like, let's take a Peyton Manning before we move on to some of these other games. But let's talk about Peyton Manning, right? Peyton Manning, when he got drafted, he had a moniker for not being able to win the big game because he lost all of his biggest games. But it was only like one game, right? Couldn't win the national championship. Can you imagine if Peyton Manning had gotten a chance to correct some of those losses and play in a playoff? For all we know, Peyton Manning would have been a college football legend. And in the reverse, Tim Tebow might have been not a legend because those Florida teams might have lost along the way to get to the national championship game. That was in the BCS era where they had to play one game to get there. So lots of narratives in college football could have changed if we had had a playoff like this for longer than we have it now. And so that's why this is a new era, because every player now judged from here henceforth will now be judged differently than they were. And we'll have to take that into consideration when we have chats like this.
Oh, absolutely. And, speaking of the playoff, to kind of hash through the last couple of games on the list here that we were going to talk about, there's a lot of great games.
There are
this weekend, but we don't have time to talk through all of them. There's a lot of great games, but Alabama at LSU.
Yes.
Night game. Okay. Alabama at LSU, night game in Death Valley, I think is like as far as like regular season game, that's not like one of these rivalry games or whatever. And maybe you could even put this in. This is like peak college football, in my opinion. Like this is a ticket that's like this is a ticket I'd pay a lot of money for.
Yes.
Truthfully,
Atmosphere
for this
fans
experience.
Yes.
And I Lane Kiffin was kind of boo-hooing about how LSU gets another night game, and that they're getting these big time opponents in prime time night game, tough environment,
money,
and they haven't. Ole Miss hasn't had a single SEC home night game this season.
But let's be fair. Hold on, before we get to that, like, does anybody really give a crap about Ole Miss at night? No. LSU and at night is a brand in and of itself. Is that fair?
Oh, absolutely it is. Okay. I mean, there's a few, just like it was a travesty that Penn State, Ohio State played at noon last Saturday.
Yes,
that should have been a 7 p.m., 8 p.m., whatever, whiteout like environment. And it was still a great environment. Don't get me wrong, but that game should have been a night game. And just like I'm sure, like at Virginia Tech, like Inner Sandman and everything in Blacksburg is better at night.
Yeah, that's why they always get a Thursday night game every year, or just about every year, because it allows that to be highlighted. Because, like it or not, it is something that is synonymous with the best parts of college football. I wish the team was better, and they're not, but Inner Sandman is still awesome, and you want to highlight those things. And I mean, this is no offense to Ole Miss fans, but like I don't know much about their traditions. How many Ole Miss traditions are up in the pantheon of college football traditions?
I'm afraid a lot of Ole Miss traditions probably aren't great. When you really start digging through the annals of history.
Yes, take the off ramp on that. And let's move on to BYU at Utah. And here's the thing. Oh, by the way, Alabama LSU is a playoff eliminator, in my opinion. Just wanted to put that out there.
And so is this game.
Well, yes, obviously. If Utah beats BYU, they're going to have to win the Big 12 to make it, and that's going to be the only
so maybe
path
it's
that
not
they
an
have.
eliminator, I guess.
But the thing I want to ask you about this is BYU is not really the intriguing team, because we know if they win, they're in, all that good stuff. But Utah, talk about a fall from grace. Cam Rising plays, looks awful, ends up, he's not going to play, right? Like, and he sat out for so long. And I talked about that with Budge when he was on here about a month ago, and how he was so frustrated with this whole situation. And it's like, this is one of those weird situations of NIL, I'm pretty sure, disagreements with the coach. And it's like, he sat out, I think, because he didn't feel like the university had his best interest in mind. Fair. But he then came back and looked awful. And so it's just weird to see this program, which has been so steadily consistent for a program that I think many people haven't really considered relevant since Urban Meyer was there. Alex Smith, that's a long time ago. And Cam Rising, I don't know what he was waiting for. I don't know. I kind of hope we get a little more information on that, because it was very strange.
It's definitely strange. I mean, honestly, to be transparent, my knowledge about it kind of just goes about as far as like the stuff that I've heard Budge say, because he's talked about it a lot. And when you guys talked about it on the show when I was gone, but it's very perplexing from what I can gather. And you're right, man, how much things have changed. Remember 2 years ago, I was pissed because Notre Dame botched the hiring of Andy Ludwig. They're Utah's offensive coordinator. And here we are 2 years later. Ludwig's been fired.
Yes.
And Notre Dame sitting with Mike Denbrock. So it's just things work out, I guess, in the end. And not that doesn't mean that Ludwig isn't a good offensive coordinator. Doesn't mean it wouldn't have worked out at Notre Dame or whatever. But I'm pretty okay with where things sit right now for the Irish. But just what a fall from grace, right? For a program, for a coordinator. And just think about how much different that guy's life would have been. You know what I mean? And like, can you tie all this to like Cam Rising? And that's just it. Like, just think about how much of it you can tie back to one guy. And maybe we don't know enough about it, like you said, but one guy and the decisions that he made, if they were just purely personal choices that impacted lives, I mean, in a greater scale, it's wild, man. I'm looking forward to the 30 for 30.
Oh, me too. Or some information, because I feel like there's just so much that we don't know. I think in this game, though, if it's a night game, Utah is obviously a great atmosphere at night, but clearly something is off. They're a very mid team this year. And BYU, I'm talking directly to you. If you want to make the playoff, you're going to have to beat the mid teams, because if you can't beat the mid teams, you're not going to beat the best of the best in the playoffs. So lots of college football matchups to look at. We did not highlight all of them, but I think the ones that you should be looking at are the ones that are sort of outside the periphery of the college football playoff, because a lot of these teams, you could be seeing their name going forward. And I'm kind of looking forward to Colorado. Like, I hope they kind of win some ball games here, because, man, the closer that Coach Prime gets to the playoff, It's what we've been hoping for, but we're not going to talk about it in length because we're going to toast their entire season if we do that. However, let's talk a little bit about the NFL. We don't have to go on and wax nostalgic about all of it, but I do want to ask you a couple questions. So the Kansas City Chiefs, 8-0 now, right? They win another close game, and they win it in overtime on Monday Night Football. Now, the biggest story coming out of that, two stories. Patrick Mahomes, once again, hurts his ankle. We'll see what happens there. But I think what everybody's questioning is the Bucs getting down, get a game-tying touchdown. They're down by 1 point. They decide to kick the extra point. They want to go to overtime. And what happens in overtime is what happens when every Patrick Mahomes team gets the coin toss in overtime. Chiefs go down and score. Game is over. There's been a lot of debate about analytics and the analytics telling you that you should kick the field goal. But when in reality, I think 5 teams have done that and lost in the analytics era. So there's not a lot of data that suggested that works. But I want to ask you philosophically, if you get numbers that tell you should kick the extra point here, how comfortable do you feel with Patrick Mahomes being anywhere near getting a lead? Now, here's the thing. There's 30 seconds left, and you're only up by 1, so they can get the lead back. But are you more inclined to go for a tie or go for a win in that scenario?
I think in this scenario, when you're the inferior team, and I think that you got to try to end it as soon as possible, because the longer that you drag it out, the longer like the law of averages is going to prevail and the better team's going to win. Because they're going to be prone to make fewer mistakes, make more big plays, so on and so forth. And I think that if you got a shot to win it right there, that moment, you got to go for it. I think about it like, if you're standing, you're on the second floor of a house and the lower level is on fire. And you're like, well, I could jump. I might break my legs, but if I land successfully, I can run away and I won't die.
That got dark.
But I could, or I could stand here and just hope the fire department shows up, before the fire gets to me and just take my chances. And that's why I think kicking the field goal, you're just leaving it all up to chance at that point. And I just think you got to go for it there. Try to get the win when you can against those types of teams, against the Patrick Mahomes of the world. There's times, we talked about analytics last year a lot. There's times where I do think you got to go with your gut, man.
Yeah, I think when you're the team in the driver's seat, like when Dan Campbell has a better football team, like the Bucs right now are decimated by injuries. Baker Mayfield has been struggling without the weapons in there. He's been throwing a lot more interceptions, missing a lot of guys, not seeing the defense as well. And when you're on the road, when you're at Arrowhead, and again, I totally understand that the analytics support kicking the extra point and taking it to overtime. But my issue is that not only are you potentially giving the ball to Patrick Mahomes in overtime, that's assuming that they don't get a field goal with 30 seconds left, but the percentages would tell you that they're probably not going to be able to get down there. But there's a lot of factors, right? But also leaving it up to a coin toss. And I think what you saw is, I don't know if you've seen the memes that are going around, but Baker Mayfield like emoted essentially when he saw that they lost the coin toss. The body language is set there. Once I saw that, I'm like, oh, the Chiefs are going to win this football game. And that's exactly what happened.
He knew that too. I mean,
yes,
he knew it.
Yes. But I think that I would not want, even if I lost by 2, I was aggressive. And in today's NFL, and even in today's football, aggressiveness is what is paying dividends for a lot of these teams and a lot of these coaches. And instead of being 5-4 and looking at your season being in a better position, now you have a losing record, all these injuries, and the Chiefs continue to just, I don't want to say skirt by, because obviously they have talent, but it's just amazing. But this is another coaching decision, and it goes into things that we have talked about before about coaching and how we're piling on to what our buddies over at Political Football talk about. And if you haven't checked them out, definitely check them out, and I'll make sure to have a pinned comment here when this is over with. But they talk about bad head coaching. So there's a lot of head coaches, I feel like, that are on the hot seat or have been fired. I don't know if you saw the Saints finally got rid of Dennis Allen. And, I mean, they won 2 games. Everybody thought they were great, and they lost 7 in a row. Looked horrible. You lose to the Panthers, you're going to get fired, right? But I don't think that what Todd Bowles did is a fireable offense, right? Because I think that there are a lot of people who would defend it based on the analytics. But a guy I do want to talk about is Nick Sirianni, a guy we've talked about a lot on here. And the Eagles, they're winning, but not well, if that makes sense. Like, they don't seem like a tough football team. They had a huge lead against the Jags. I think they were up 22, end up winning by 5. I don't know if you saw like 3-4 weeks ago, Sirianni was jabbing a little bit with the Eagles fans in the stands because they were chanting for him to get fired and all that. And I want to ask you a question about coaching. Like, are you pulling the trigger on a guy that you know is not working out? Like, what's the line for you? Because there's probably like 5 or 6 head coaches in the NFL that a lot of people have said, oh, you should get rid of this guy. Like, what's your line? Do you think it makes sense to get rid of a guy in the middle of the season, or do you just sort of let it ride out?
I think it's a case-by-case basis. If I were the Chicago Bears, I would have fired Matty Eberflus.
Jeez.
2 weeks ago.
Season.
Yeah, I would have fired him in the offseason, truthfully, because I did hear a stat, but the other day that, so going back to Mitchell Trubisky, he gets drafted, gets 1 year with John Fox, and when they fire him, then he gets was it Matt Nagy at that point?
My God, I forgot about John Fox.
He gets Matt Nagy, and then finally they bring in Justin Fields. Justin Fields gets 1 year with Matt Nagy, and then they go to so it's like, and the same exact thing is going to happen to Caleb Williams. He's going to get 1 year, and then he's going to get a new head coach, a new coordinator next year. So this is 3 quarterbacks in a row that you've drafted high in the first round that you have not done a single thing as an organization to put them in a position to be successful. I think in this situation, now the owners are old school, so they won't do it mid-season. But in this case, I think you just got to rip the Band-Aid off, get that guy out of there, and try to bring some stability. You don't want your young, talented quarterback having the impending firing of his head coach hanging over his head the entire season, like knowing it's coming. Like, you just create a bad environment in the locker room. Now, a situation like the Eagles where they're winning, like,
you're not firing Sirianni,
you can't fire him. But there's a lot of there are certainly weird. I think it's just case by case. What's your situation?
Is he holding the team back though?
This is what we don't know. I mean, maybe we've been hard on him. Maybe he is, but maybe he's like, maybe that team is like super dysfunctional internally, and he's somehow like putting it all together. Like, maybe he's the guy that's holding it all together. We don't know. It certainly doesn't look good from the outside, especially when you see the guy John with fans.
Well, that's a bad look. Like, I don't care if you won. Like, it's Philadelphia, first of all. Like, they're going to do whatever they want. But the Sirianni thing is fascinating because it's obvious that the Eagles have talent. And they peaked when they went to the Super Bowl. Last year, they had all those issues off the field. And you said it was going to happen again. I don't know if it's necessarily happening again, but I don't get a good vibe about Sirianni as their head coach, especially when it seems like the team needs to really rally together, kind of like Miami, to win a lot of these football games at the end. I mean, the Jaguars not been playing great football this year, and when you let this happen. But here's another guy I want to ask you about, because I know he's a guy you've been a fan of. What about Mike McDaniel?
No, I think he's going to be given some grace because of the Tua stuff, I think.
When does that run out, though? That's the question I want to ask.
So so I don't know what Tua's contract looks like. But it's like, who do you move off of first?
Right. But they're not going to move off of Tua because they just signed him. But the question I have for you is, that's an interesting scenario because wins and losses, easy metric. You lost the locker room even on a winning team, right? Like, if the Eagles are held back because Nick Sirianni doesn't have his locker room, you get rid of the guy. Mike McDaniel is an interesting case. The players love to play for him. Clearly, he has a good scheme because they've had success. But the biggest metric that stands out to me, whether Tua is in or not, is that his teams are awful down the stretch. And people are trying to tell me that it was a quality loss to Buffalo. And I'm like, but they never beat Buffalo. And that's the team that they need to beat. So, like, what's the metric for a guy like McDaniel who has shown really good flashes? The players love him, but there's something that's not being put together. And I think what's happening with him is, well, Tua hasn't been in. Well, how long does he get that currency? Because at some point you have to win.
No, that's a good question. I don't know if I can come up with one, and I know that I'm supposed to in this situation, but
no, it's fair.
That's a tough one, man. And I think the organization, with Tua's fragility, if you will, the organization has an obligation, I think, at this point to really shore up the backup quarterback position. Just because, for real though, because the guy has not been able to stay on the field. And you got to get somebody in there that you trust that can come in and play half the season if they have to. I know that no one ever plans on losing their starting quarterback, but I don't even know who is their backup. Who was it that came in and played? I don't even know, man.
I think it was Nate Hundley. I think the guy that was the backup. The guy that backed up Lamar Jackson, who was kind of like Lamar Jackson light last year, which is why when Lamar Jackson was out, the Ravens were able to, or maybe it's 2 years ago, but he was a guy that was able to have a similar skill set to Lamar Jackson. But the reason I ask this is because you have all these different coaches and all these different scenarios, and like each of them is different. But the one I do want to ask you about that is interesting is McCarthy. And the Cowboys have high expectations of themselves, but the team is obviously not performing. He's in like his 4th year with that team, and the team stinks. Like they're just not good. And they've had a lot of defensive injuries, but offensively they look bad. And it's like, why can't Jerry fire a guy in the middle of the season? I know it doesn't solve anything, but like, doesn't it set a tone for a franchise that should be like, they should not be above firing a coach midseason because they have standards?
I think that Jerry's ego won't let him do it because I think he sees it as an admission that he was wrong. Whether it's moving off of players, firing the head coach after just a couple seasons, or firing you, I think that he sees it as admitting that he made a mistake. And that's, I mean, I don't know if you heard that little radio interview he did with like the local Dallas guys.
Yes.
Remember? I mean, he's like, I'll find someone else to ask me the questions, you know? I mean, and they weren't asking unfair questions, I don't think,
completely
at all.
fair questions. If you're the if you're the owner and you're going to do weekly radio interviews, be prepared to answer tough questions when the team sucks. Not only the owner, but the GM too. Be prepared because that's your job now. He's the only owner that does weekly interviews like this. And so for him to get pissed because the team's bad, it's all on you, buddy.
I think he's a great owner, like from a business perspective.
Sure.
I think there's no questioning that. He's
tons of money.
He's a terrible GM.
Oh
my
good
goodness.
Lord.
Absolutely terrible GM.
Well, he certainly doesn't get the right coaches. So I want to check in after last week. The Lions beat the Packers. How is your bandwagon status? Have you gotten your card in the mail yet?
I haven't gotten my card in the mail. Maybe they're just waiting to see if I'm going to hang tough. Waiting to see if I'll hang on through some Lions adversity if it ever shows itself. But this is a team that, I mean, they're not beating people. They are beating people,
yes.
Like physically beating people.
Kneecaps, baby.
Yes. I mean, and that's just it. I mean, they have become exactly what Dan Campbell told everyone that they were going to be. Like, this is 1,000% what he was talking about in that press conference, and everybody thought he was a lunatic. This is what he envisioned. Lunatic, yeah, but this is his vision in motion. We're happening right now, and it's incredible, man. And like I've heard people say, Detroit Lions may very well be the best team in the National Football League.
Oh, I think they are. I think that if the Lions would get a shot at them in the Super Bowl, I think it would be incredible, and I do hope we get that, because if anybody would prevent the Kansas City Chiefs from three-peating, the Detroit Lions winning their first Super Bowl in the Super Bowl era would be absolutely incredible for that city, that fan base, and obviously Dave, political football, and you as a new bandwagon Lions fan.
That's right.
That's right. So let's go over just a couple of games. We'll just list them off. Don't need to do them in length. Bengals at Ravens. Obviously, this is big for your favorite division, the NFC North. The Bengals are kind of like a Jekyll and Hyde team. They look good. They look bad. Not really sure if that's a coach, what the problem is there. And obviously, the Ravens are a good football team, and they just need to keep winning. Bo Nix and the Broncos, who just got their ass handed to them by the Ravens, traveled to Arrowhead as a consolation prize. So that should be awesome for Sean Payton. Hopefully, Patrick Mahomes puts up about 58 fantasy points, just because that'll mean that Sean Payton has to go home with his head hanging low. 49ers at Bucs. The reason this is interesting is because both of these teams are decimated by injuries. Are the 49ers still good without all these guys? The Bucs, I think, are kind of trending downward. Somehow, the game of the week by record, Steelers and Commanders. We all had that, right?
The Commanders have looked really good.
They both have.
Yeah, and I mean, Jay Daniels is a stud. And
yes, he is. He really
Russ
is.
And Mike Tomlin just finds a way. The guy is just Mr. Consistent, I guess.
Never had a losing season.
No, and good for the Commanders. And with all the stuff that organization's been through over the last 4 or 5 years or whatever, good for them. And hopefully it's a pleasant. The fine folks of Washington, as you are very close to that area, the fine folks of Washington deserve maybe something little positive happening in the neighborhood. I'm sure that, obviously there's just been a lot of turmoil surrounding everything that's been happening. in the political realm. And so it's got to be nice to have this football team as a pleasant distraction, I'd have to imagine.
Yes, I know that this city is a Commanders city for sure. And when they are good, this city is popping, or the area, I would say, is popping. A lot of the Maryland area, the DC area, and obviously some Northern Virginia people as well. Eagles at Cowboys, this game only matters because if the Cowboys don't win, the NFC East is pretty much locked up for the Eagles, so we'll see about that. And I think game of the week from this show's perspective, Lions at Texans, and I'm not going to play the music. I think we're going to stop playing the stat of the week music, but I do have an interesting stat for you about the Lions. Did you know that last week at Lambeau was their first game played outdoors all season?
No kidding?
Yes. First
Holy
game played,
smokes.
and they're playing in a dome this week. So they actually, I think they only play 2 games, maybe 3 outdoors the entire season.
That's crazy.
I know. I couldn't believe Scott Hansen said it, and I was like, that can't be true. And I'm like, why am I not believing the guy?
It's going to become more and more. I mean, it's going to become a rarity that teams are playing outdoors.
Well, if you think about the division, right? You have the Vikings, and obviously you have the Lions. So those are 2 dome teams right there. The Bears obviously play outdoors. The Packers play outdoors. So that's 2. But they played, I think, the NFC West. So they had Arizona, and they're going to play the Rams indoors, right? So and every home game that they have is indoors. It was just amazing. I'm like, wow, they really are not going to have to go and play outdoors. But
the Bears are building a new stadium with a roof on it.
A dome, of course.
So, yep.
Well, here's the thing, right? So it was their first game outdoors in the rain, awful weather, and they looked like the Packers should have looked at Lambeau. So I don't think it's going to be a problem.
Lions weather.
Absolutely. So that'll be an interesting thing to watch. And we obviously have talked about the NFL. We have talked about the college football playoff. I mean, it's there's a lot going on in football right now. So just because it is November doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't anything to talk about. We are just getting to the final act as it gets to football. So I'm very excited. But before we get out of here, Coach, you got one more thing to do. Coach's pick of the week. Unfortunately, you are on a 2-game losing streak as the Duke Blue Devils did not come even close, actually, to beating the Miami Hurricanes. In the end, it was close at one point. You texted me, and then after you texted me, it was all over from there. So you have a chance to redeem yourself, my friend, and this is your 10th game picked this year. So please bless us with a pick of the week.
Hear ye, hear ye. Do you smell that, degenerates? That is redemption. It is in the air this week. And the pick of the week this week takes us to Lubbock, Texas, to a team that is coming off a big victory last week over the Iowa State Cyclones. I'm talking about the Texas Tech Red Raiders hosting the Colorado Buffaloes and Coach Prime as they come to town. The Colorado Buffaloes are 3.5-point favorites this week. They are just on the outside looking in of the college football playoff periphery, trying to find their way into the Big 12 title game and give us all the entertainment and excitement that we are looking for. And that being said, this week's pick of the week, listen closely, get out your wallets. The Texas Tech Raiders plus 3.5 against the Colorado Buffaloes. I'm not going to, you know what? I'm not even going to take the points. Texas Tech money line straight up to beat the Buffs.
Wow, Texas Tech to upset the Colorado Buffaloes in what would be devastating for Colorado's Big 12 championship run. You never know, man. Hopefully this is redemption for you. You're not a Coach Prime hater. I know that if this goes in reverse, you're going to be a happy man because Colorado's going to continue climbing. But Texas Tech is a good team. Budge has been high in them. And obviously, having knocked off Iowa State, they're in a good place. So, Coach, so let it be written. So let it be done. And that brings us to the end, my friend. A shorter than usual football frenzy, but with all the things that we got going on, we just wanted to come on the air. It's always nice to chat it up because it's just a nice break from what we have going on. And this is the only way we get to see each other, even though we are friends, we are good friends, brothers even. This is the only way we get to chat sometimes. So it's always good to come on here and do a little water cooler talk with us and all of our loyal fans. So do you have anything you'd like to add before we get the hell out of here?
Could have said it better, man. Absolutely. It's a nice, pleasant distraction from reality. kind of a little bit of an escape. Thank you all for joining us. Yes, I'm hedging my bets a little bit with the pick of the week because I'll be happy with whatever the result is. Honestly, it'll kind of work both ways for me. And, so I'll be keeping an eye on that game. And, a lot of exciting games coming up this weekend. We talked about a few of them, but the college slate's really impressive. There's a lot of meaningful football being played. And then, there's a few storylines in the NFL. We're going to start seeing coaches get fired and things like that. So it's going to get wild there as well. We're getting to the part, the time of year where weather's going to start playing a factor too in some of these games, which will be fun to see. And college basketball's upon us. So a lot going on here. And always a pleasure. Again, thanks everybody. Thank you for, Sam, especially Dad, for hopping into the comments, chiming in. Good questions, good conversation about the playoff. And I think we'll have plenty to talk about next week when we see the, what the new rankings look like.
Couldn't have said it better myself. I want to thank everybody who's new, everybody who's old. We appreciate every single person who gives even a second of your time to our dumbasses over here. We don't know everything. We know just enough to be dangerous, and we hope this finds everybody well and safe. If you want to follow us on all of our social media platforms, feel free to do so. All you Bradley fans out there who are listening to this, we hope to see you every single time we do Braves Talk. So for me and the coach, we'll see you next time. This is Football Frenzy. The opinions and viewpoints expressed on I&C Sports are those of Matt Freites, Brad Powell, and their guests, and not necessarily those of the Matty Ice Media Network. I&C Sports is exclusively owned by Matt Freites and Brad Powell and is brought to you by the Matty Ice Media Network.